Good day, everyone. It's Alan Schimmel, and you're listening to another DevOps webinar. Actually, today it's a DevOps chat. Waving hi to you here. I am on location in Miami Beach, Florida today, and joining me from his office, which is not as pretty as Miami Beach, Florida, Jeff Hughes from CA. Jeff, welcome.
Thank you, Alan. I wish I were there.
Well, we could arrange it for a small fee, but Jeff, why don't I did a lousy job of introducing you, though. Why don't you introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. Welcome, everybody, to this chat we're going to have on data privacy. I have about 25 years in the technology industry. I've worked for a number of high-tech companies in security and networking and so on. So I have a kind of a broad, lengthy career in technology. And one of my passions is writing. I love to speak and write. I've authored a number of books and white papers, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today, Alan.
Thank you, Jeff. And we've done a few of these. For our audience, maybe just logging on now, it's a if we could go back to the first slide, please. These are informal sort of video chats where we take a dive on a subject. They are sponsored by CA Technologies. And today's chat is around data privacy, why your company needs to pay attention to what's behind the compliance curtain. Pay no attention to the man there behind the green curtain. But you know, Jeff, as we were talking, actually, before we jump into it, let me just, for our audience, these chats really become so much better when they're interactive with the audience. And we have a number of ways for you to interact here. The first way that I would really ask that everyone participates in is the questions. We will answer your questions. We'll take them in real time if we can. We'll take them at the end if we don't have time to do them in real time, but we'll try to get to all of your questions. And if you look at your GoToWebinar control panel, you should see a question section there. And if you hit the little arrow and it expands, you see you can type your questions in. You can type them in. I'll see them. We'll queue them. And Jeff and I will do our best to get you some answers. If you're having technical difficulties, though, maybe the video's choppy, the audio's not working good, it's been known to happen. Please, if you can, use the chat section down at the bottom of your GoToWebinar control panel. And we do have engineers standing by who will try their best to help you. No guarantees, but they'll do everything they can to make your experience the best it can be. So that being said, then, Jeff, let's dive in. You know,
Okay.
off mic, off camera, I was telling you that I was out at RSA conference last week, which is the biggest security or cybersecurity, whatever you want to call it, event in the world now. And it was interesting in that GDPR seemed to be everywhere, right? And, you know, we're about, is it a full month away? May 25th, yeah. Right?
Yep.
31 days or thereabouts after so many years of waiting for GDPR. And you know, sure enough, Jeff, our emails, and my staff behind the scenes can attest to this, our emails all of a sudden full, or our email boxes are full with third-party partners and providers of ours asking questions now, you know, just 30 days before. Hey, what are you guys doing about GDPR, right? I mean, do you have a statement we could use? Do you know, what are you doing? Are we a collector? Are we a processor? And, you know, all of these things. So it's interesting. I'm wondering if you would see this.
Absolutely. You know, you mentioned RSA, and we had a presence at RSA as well. And so a lot of the questions that came up around GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation, are being asked by a lot of companies. It seems like it takes, you know, 2 years ago we started talking about GDPR and the importance of that regulation. And now, within the past month or couple of months, people have started to wake up to that. You have very big companies that are global and international that are paying close attention to GDPR. Certainly Facebook comes to mind with their recent issues. They actually had laid plans quite a while ago to address GDPR and its significance, setting up a privacy hub where end users could go in and configure for data privacy. So they take it very seriously. A lot of other companies have come to us recently and said, hey, how do we prepare for GDPR? How do we get more focus on this? And so we're providing information and assistance and certainly solutions for them to help address GDPR.
Yep. Jeff, let's take a step back, though, because we're not at RSA, frankly. We're not even on a quote-unquote Security Boulevard chat or webinar. We're on DevOps. And so, though I am a big believer that developers no one raises their hand and says, I want to develop in secure code, or I want an app that I develop to have a major breach. Right? We all want to have secure, I think, applications and everything. But let's start with some basics. When we say, the GDPR is about data privacy, what do we mean by data privacy?
Yeah, it's a good question. Data privacy, if you take it to its basic level, really is about the collection and dissemination of personal information. So, a lot of consumers over the years have either, knowingly or unknowingly freely given their personal information. Now with recent breaches, Facebook comes to mind, of course, top of the news stories. The question becomes, how are they disseminating this personal information? So data privacy really is, you'll hear the terms data protection, data privacy. It really is that relationship, though, with the gathering of personal data and how it's disseminated. People have given their data over the years, and now that they're finding out, hey, I didn't know it was going to be disseminated or given out in quite this way, people are now starting to pay a lot closer attention to this topic.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And Jeff, as silly as it sounds, I almost hate to say it, is all it took to pass some GDPR regulation to get the increased scrutiny and interest up? Why, obviously there's a sudden rush to the data privacy and personally identifiable information, PII, that we're seeing. And a lot of it, I guess, does come from, the fact that GDPR is finally upon us.
Yeah, I think it's a combination, though, of things. Certainly, GDPR is getting a lot of news play, and obviously in EMEA, in Europe, in those countries where it's that regulation was passed. But I think it coincides with the data privacy issues that we're seeing. Facebook, of course, has brought to light how companies are using personal data, personal information of their consumers. So I think it's a combination. It's like the perfect storm of events. You have this regulation that's coming down on us next month, and then you have, Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg being called to testify in Congress about how they're handling personal data. Companies like Google as well mine tons of personal data. If they didn't do that, how would they be able to target you for specific ads and so on? So I think it's a combination of, yes, we have this regulation, but now we hear about 87 million user accounts that were I don't want to say breached, but they were used by this analytics, Cambridge Analytics. Other recent reports say that the number is much greater than 87 million. So we're seeing a lot of news play on this, and a lot of companies are now starting to pay attention to the regulation. Companies in North America, though, are looking at GDPR and trying to figure out, do we have to comply with that regulation or not? In fact, I've heard recently that some companies are changing their terms of condition to exclude themselves from GDPR. So, having people check a box or say, since you are not an EU citizen, then GDPR does not apply to you. So companies are really grappling with how do we try to comply with this regulation? Do we try to get around the regulation? And what steps are they taking? It really comes down to this, the fine print that none of us read in terms of use. So all those boxes that we check when we sign up for things that we don't read the fine print and the terms of conditions and so on are really taking the forefront now, and people need to pay closer attention. Consumers especially need to pay closer attention to what's in that fine print.
Absolutely. A couple of things, Jeff. First of all, I think the word you were maybe looking for, and especially in regard to like the Cambridge Analytica, was scraping, right? Data scraping,
yes.
Where these people are just scraping the data and much of it personally identifiable information out of accounts or out of the data stored on accounts like your Facebook account or Twitter account, or in the case of Cambridge, it was Facebook. But it could just, let's be clear, it could just as easily be info. I forgot the name of it now. What's the one they bought? Instagram or Twitter or any of these things, or any of these social media stuff. And it doesn't even have to be social media. There are plenty, when you think about it, all the applications that use Facebook to allow you to log on, right, are now connected in that web. And so that information is, not only your Facebook information per se, but we know Jeff uses Facebook to access or for authentication for such and such and such and such sites and applications that, again, are personally identifiable. On top of that, though, Jeff, let's turn to this novel approach that some companies are taking, which is, they're trying to opt out of GDPR. Well, good luck when the EU comes calling, right? And they say, okay, you don't have to pay us the fine. Just make sure you never do business with anybody who does business over here. And, I think you'll find that companies that could get away with that are few and far between. What do you think?
Yeah, when I heard about that some companies were trying to change their terms of condition, their end user license agreements, for example, to opt out of GDPR, I think that's a slippery slope because, as you mentioned, most companies, many companies have EU citizens' data within their databases, and so to figure out a way to exclude North American customers and have them opt out of being compliant with agreeing to the stipulations of GDPR is probably not going to work. For those of you that are new to GDPR, GDPR basically provides broad enhancements and broad capabilities for the end user. So the end user, for example, can opt out of having their data used for any purpose. They can send a letter to that particular company and say, I want to be forgotten in terms of you sharing any of my information with anyone. I don't want it used for marketing purposes. I don't want it used for testing. So if you're, testing applications and you're using production data and so on, they're opting, this is an issue for companies, and GDPR is providing broad rights to the end user. So the other thing I would add, Alan, is that, as we see these breaches occur, what is the reaction? What will the reaction of Congress be when they are interviewing Facebook CEO and, chances are they're going to look at Google and things like that. The next step to that is we will probably enact additional legislation here in the United States. In fact, they are looking at that. The Congress is looking at enacting additional legislation from a federal level, from a broad level, to enact specific controls about how our data is being used. So right now we have very vertical laws here in the United States. You have HIPAA that regulates healthcare, for example, PCI that regulates credit card use and banking. You have GLBA, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, and so on. And these are very vertical regulations. We even have different states within the United States that have enacted regulations specifically on a statewide level. But what we're talking about is additional regulation more at a federal level. And I think that even if you try to opt out or get your users to opt out of GDPR, that might be a temporary fix for some companies. But the bottom line is that we are going to see more regulation, not less. It's just the nature of where we're at.
Sure. So Jeff, couple of comments on that is number one, look, I don't even know if you want to play the game of opt-out versus because I don't have an EU customer or I don't do business with any companies that do business in EU. That really is a dangerous web you're weaving. And with the fining protocols or guidelines in GDPR, I don't know if I play that game. I think you got to be pretty reckless to even play that game. But I want to point out something else. You mentioned PCI, and then you mentioned HIPAA, Gramm-Leach-Bliley, et cetera.
Yep.
PCI is relatively unique in that it's actually not a government-enforced regulation, totally industry-led. And the thought, I remember when it came out, I was involved. The thought there was, let us do something before the government steps in and has to, right? And it's kind of a U.S. attitude is, hey, let's not let Big Brother tell us what to do. We'll tell ourselves what to do. And that's okay. If you can do it and do it in such a way that it really helps and it preempts government intervention, God bless you. But you're still going to have this privacy. There's just no way of getting around it in today's world with everything we're dealing in. The other thing, Jeff, and you touched on it, is, frankly, the U.S. has been a hodgepodge of privacy and data privacy regulations, state to state, locality to locality, vertical to vertical for some time.
Mm-hmm.
Having some uniformity may not be a bad thing, right?
Yeah, and you bring up a couple of great points in terms of regulation. Take the example of Facebook. Facebook says that they asked Cambridge Analytica to delete the information that they had. Cambridge Analytica says that they did delete it. Facebook says that they didn't delete it. So we have these companies that are in disagreement. And so I think that's why we're going to see the government step in and say, individual companies are trying to govern themselves, but we see that it's not really happening to the level that we need to have it happen. So I think that's perhaps one of the reasons why, Big Brother's gonna step in. I fully expect that to happen over the next couple of years. The other thing I wanted to point out, though, is, and it's really the title of the presentation today, why your company needs to pay attention to what's behind the compliance curtain, is my opinion is that being compliant is good business. It just is good business to be compliant and have safeguards in place to be compliant with these regulations. What if you get breached? How are you going to respond? What if an end user asks you to delete their data? Do you have a plan in place to respond? The reason I say that is it is good business practice. It is brand management. Because when these things happen and you don't have a plan in place, your brand gets harmed to a big degree. You incur financial losses. The press loves to take advantage of trashing companies that have lost personally identifiable information. They splash it over all the headlines. It makes for good press. And so your brand suffers a tremendous amount of damage, and that's why you need to pay attention to what's behind this compliance curtain. Understand what the regulations are. To me, they're minimum baseline requirements. You should have much more stringent and secure safeguards in place to manage personal data. And so, if you adjust your mindset a little bit and say, okay, these things are actually going to help us to be a better company and to protect our brand, that's why you should pay attention to what's behind the compliance curtain.
Yep. Jeff, if you don't mind, I'm going to grab in a question from our audience here.
Sure.
Audience asks, can we put some light or shine some light on the demonstration of accountability, which again is GDPR kind of lingo in there, but I think it's applicable across. What can you say about that, Jeff?
As far as shedding light on accountability, again, I think the challenge here at least in North America, as we've been talking about, is there's a hodgepodge of regulations. There is, it's a very vertical approach. We have states that have enacted legislation for various protections. I would say that accountability is, or prosecution, I guess, of companies that have failed to protect corporate data has, in my opinion, not been severe enough. We haven't had enough situations where companies or executives and so on are held to a higher standard, are held accountable for for their actions and how personal data is being managed. Now Mark Zuckerberg was called to excuse me just a minute here. Lost power there for a second.
Yeah, sorry, you got a little brownout. I got nervous.
Anyway, companies. So Congress has is possibly thinking they're doing their part, calling in Mark Zuckerberg to testify to Congress to demonstrate accountability, but it hasn't gone far enough. I mean, we haven't seen where companies have to demonstrate compliance more fully, more regularly. I think it's like any of these legislations. They can only go so far in terms of the impact that they can have, and that's kind of what my argument is that try not to look at compliance as, we need to be held, or we're going to be held accountable, or we're fearful that something's going to happen to us. I would prefer that you look at it from a brand standpoint and how much damage is going to occur to your individual brand, because that's really what the end result is. No legislation or prosecution of executives or anything like that is going to be greater than the damage that you incur to your brand. That is the ultimate punishment, in my opinion, is when you lose business and your brand is tarnished and harmed for years to come.
Yeah. Jeff, as you know, and like you, I've been in the security game for a long time. What was always interesting to me is when we talked about the breaches back in the, let's say, early to mid, 2005 to 2010 kind of era, even before that, there were studies done that breaches long-term did not cause significant brand damage, right? When you looked at public companies that were breached, within 12 months of the breach or the breach announcement, generally their stock had returned to pre-breach levels or greater, and so they didn't suffer any long-term kind of damage, and they paid, what turned out to be mere pittances for them in fines and went on with their day.
Mm-hmm.
I think that game all changed with Target, frankly, the Target breach, where, right, it cost Target's CEO and much of their executive IT team their jobs. And that scenario has now been repeated time and time again with some of these, whether it be Equifax or what have you. And so, the damage to brand is real. There's no longer any ifs, ands, or buts, right?
Yeah.
You're going to get punished for it.
Yeah, I think you're right. Target was probably the turning point here in North America, where you saw not only did the stock price come down, that was one example, but executives actually lost their jobs, and people stopped shopping at Target, stopped going in. Target's had other issues as well, kind of political types of issues. With some of their corporate policies and things like that. We won't get into it on this call, but I think all of the culmination of all of that has caused people to take a closer look at data privacy. I think Facebook is also maybe one of those turning points where,
Yep.
as an individual consumer, I'm taking a closer look at how my personal data is being used. I know when I had heard about that, I thought, wow, where's my data going? What are they using it for? How is it being used? I can tell you that I never once read any end user license agreement. I don't remember checking any box. And yet my data, I'm sure, is being used all over the place. And so I think with that, Alan, I think people are becoming more aware of this issue and this concern. So the potential for brand damage is real, and the potential for that to be permanent or altering to the company, I believe, is more real now than it's ever been.
Absolutely. I will just mention that many of my friends in the security world, after the Facebook brouhaha, were putting up instructions for their non-tech friends on how to go into Facebook and see what data do they actually have, and what are they, how are they representing you? And it was I don't know if you did it for your own profile. It's pretty eye-opening when you look at how much they've gathered, and then based upon that, where they put you, right? In terms of what your political leanings are, what your interests are, what your dislikes are, all of that good stuff. It's scary. And I will tell you, Jack, I mean, since then, I am engaging less and less on Facebook. And when I do, I stay away from current events. I don't want to be boxed like that again. And, I went and deleted a lot of it. God knows if it's really deleted, right? But,
So you're not taking any more, you're not playing any more quizzes or anything on
Facebook?
No,
well, I was never a quiz guy anyway, but it's scary. I mean, when you looked at, here's who you liked, and they have that whole history there. If that's not enough to scare the heck out of you, I showed it to my kids as well and said, hey, they've built the book on you. They've written a book on you here. And, if you want to be silly enough to keep giving them more information to write that book, have at it. But if I were you, I'd stop. But
good point.
Yeah, it is. It's scary stuff. And I would look, anyone listening to this, you should go on, if you have a Facebook account, you should go into your settings and see, what they've got there. Yeah. Anyway, Jeff, I wanted to bring up another point, and we've sort of touched on, we called it a hodgepodge. So the problem with the hodgepodge is, how can a company who does business, look, DevOps.com is a relatively small company, right? But we do business all over the world. We have a lot of EU business. We do business in Asia, and of course here in the US and North and South America. How could one company, especially, I don't have a team of lawyers on this. How do we comply with so many different data privacy laws?
Yeah, that's a very difficult challenge for companies to address, especially smaller companies. DevOps.com, for example, may take credit cards, so they've got to look at PCI compliance. You might have to comply with GDPR because you've got customers in the EU and so on. It is a big challenge for companies, and certainly on this call we're not going to figure that out. But I can offer a couple of suggestions. First of all, the first step that a company needs to take, if they haven't already, is to understand where their personal data resides, where that PII information resides. It doesn't matter what the regulation is. You really have to understand where the data resides to begin with, so that you can then develop a plan around that. And so, For example, CA Technologies, we've got some tools. We have a product called Test Data Manager that allows you to locate PII information on your databases. You can select the database. It'll do a scan of the database and tell you where the PII data resides. And then you can take steps to mitigate that particular circumstance. The other thing I would point out is that there is a crossover between different regulations. They're not all, completely separately defined. There's a crossover, an overlap between what those requirements are. So HIPAA or PCI or now GDPR, they all have some common elements that run through them. One of them obviously is, hey, you got to know where your data, your sensitive data resides as the first step. So I would point out those things. And the third thing is, if a company is actively involved in trying to be compliant with whatever regulation it is, that is far better than having done nothing. Okay?
Amen.
So a lot of times people will say, well, I can't do anything now. GDPR is a month away. Well, you can do something. You can at least start to locate where your sensitive data is and have a report and be able to generate reports and so on. So if you're ever caught up in a legal situation where the courts or somebody is saying, you need to demonstrate compliance, at least you have something to show. Hey, we're on the path to compliance, we're demonstrating compliance. And really, I don't know if you ever arrive at 100% compliance with these things. It's more, have you put safeguards in place to be compliant? Do you have the capacity to notify customers when a breach occurs? Do you have the capacity to locate where their sensitive data resides and so on? So you can take steps, and you can start those steps right now. As long as you're on the path to being compliant with whatever regulation it is, that's far better than having done nothing.
Absolutely. And Jeff, that's something I've been telling people about compliance for much longer than GDPR has been announced, right? And that is, and I think you touched on it before, I use the term least common denominator, right?
Yep.
Compliance is probably the LCD of security, right? It's such a low bar. And when you look across compliance statutes or regs, they're all relatively, based on, for the most part, common sense, what you should do to ensure data privacy and so forth. But B, yep, they really represent the minimum, right? If that's all you're doing, I wouldn't necessarily call you safe. I'd call you compliant, but not secure. And there's a difference, and I think that's what we're trying to get to. But Jeff, what can a company do, beyond just mere compliance? And I don't mean to minimize it, but beyond mere compliance, what do you, what's your prescription?
Well, yeah, and I think you raise a good point. Compliance, it really is a fairly low bar. If you take a look at GDPR, you take a look at these regulations, it really is, like you said, a least common denominator. It is the basic low bar or threshold that every company should take a look at. And so, but beyond that, there is, and it depends on the size of your company. Each company has to take a look at what their needs are in terms of demonstrating compliance. If you're a small company, compliance might mean that you do a quarterly or even annual audit for PCI, for example, where you self-audit and demonstrate that you are compliant within the particular scope that you have for your business. Larger companies, certainly companies like CA and so on, we have vendors and we have all kinds of third-party contractors, and we have prepared for GDPR compliance. By the way, we are ready for GDPR in terms of how we protect company records. So you have to take a look at the size of your company and then evaluate what tools are available for you. So, I mean, at a low level, a smaller company, it might be, okay, we're going to have password policies in place. We're going to require passwords to be changed every 3 months. That may be, a level of security that they have. We're going to implement desktop security controls or client access controls or privileged access management types of controls. CA sells a number of products in these security areas, for example, that can assist companies in that. Larger companies are not only going to have require password changes, desktop controls, they're also going to have perimeter protection. So, firewall protection and perimeter device protection and so on. So it's this layered security approach that companies have to take a look at. And so, a company like CA, big companies such as our size, we invest millions of dollars in all kinds of different security controls to protect data access. So again, it's a hard question to answer. You have to look at your situation, your size of company, and develop a security and compliance strategy. And by the way, if you are secure to the level that you need to be for your company, the chances are you're going to be compliant as well. So, that's another way to look at it.
I agreed 100%. So I used to say that being secure generally means you're compliant, but being compliant doesn't generally mean you're secure.
That's right.
Kind of like the old macaroni and spaghetti philosophy I learned in 4th grade. All spaghetti's macaroni, but not all macaroni is spaghetti. Anyway,
That's right.
Jeff, let's head into the backstretch here. So, look, as we said at the outset, GDPR is 31 days away. If you're sitting out here and listening to this and says, oh my God, I haven't done anything, what can we do? Is it too late? Just the heck with it? Hope for the best? What do you suggest?
No, I mean, it's like I said earlier, it's not too late. Even if you get to the 26th of May, it's not too late. These regulations aren't going to go away anytime soon. So the important thing is to get started. And again, I can emphasize, I think the first step in your journey to being compliant, and this could be GDPR or any compliance regulation or mandate such as PCI, is to find out where your sensitive data resides. Now, for small companies, that may be easy. It's on a server, it's on this, in this database, and that's where we have our sensitive data. But having the right tools to, locate that sensitive data is going to be able to help you to report on it and then to devise a strategy of how you're going to manage that sensitive information. Now, many companies, mid-size or large companies, of course, have databases all over. And so it's a much bigger challenge to identify where that sensitive information is. If you have a fairly large company, the chances are you have compliance officers and security officers and so on. The important thing is to get together and devise a plan to identify first where the data resides. I can't emphasize that enough. You have to know where the sensitive data exists so that then you can devise a plan. Now, what would that plan be? It might be that we are going to encrypt all the data. We're going to now change how we store data. We're going to encrypt all that sensitive information. It might be that we're going to delete some of that information. It may be, I work in the testing industry. We sell products that help companies test their applications. And so a lot of times companies will use production data for testing. And so the question becomes, well, how do we manage that sensitive information? Do we mask it, or do we generate data synthetically and not worry about compliance? So Test Data Manager, for example, from CA, will let you generate data from scratch. So you don't have to use real production data. Anyway, my point is that when you know where the data is, then you can devise a plan to manage that data. It might be to encrypt it. It might be to delete it. It may be to leave it alone and not use any of that data at all. and so on. So depending on the size of the company is going to determine what your approach is going to be.
Yep. Jeff, I want to emphasize something that you've been talking about, though. And, the nuance of it, I don't know if everyone picks it up, right? You may have PII information on customers, visitors, what have you, and you could lock it in the greatest vault in the world that's totally secure, right, and compliant. But if you then go take that data and use it for your test data, which so many companies do, right? Because companies that test, they want to test on real data to get real use cases, right? And you take it out of that vault to just use internally for your test, and you suffer a breach or something happens, or you don't have permission to use that data, right, for those test purposes. That's the same as, you're subject to fines. You're subject to breach notifications and everything else. The same way as if someone broke into the safe, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And some companies are under that impression. Well, as long as we keep that data internal and we're just using it for testing purposes. But I can give you many examples of companies that have suffered data breaches on test servers where they extracted the production data to a test server, and then we're using that data for various testing purposes. That server was connected to the internet, somebody hacked in, and they stole those records. So that really brings up the issue of, data privacy is about the collection and the dissemination of data. I don't think any of us disagree that, companies have to have personal data. They're going to have credit cards. They're going to have our name, address, and phone number. That's how we transact business. That's how we do commerce. And so that's a part of what we do as a business. Now, in testing, if you take that data and you mishandle it, just like you would in any other breach, but in a testing scenario, if you mishandle that production data or you don't properly scramble the data, which is masking the data, or take other means to protect it, you are absolutely liable for the misuse of that data. So again, data privacy is all about how do we handle and care for sensitive personal data.
Jeff, I have one other area I want to bring up, and then maybe we'll wrap up. And this is something that I picked up recently at the RSA conference. And that is this idea that, look, GDPR was announced 2 to 3 years in advance. It's given everyone a chance to get ready for it. But that at least initially for the first year or two, they're probably going to not, levy the fines and enforcements that the regulations call for, to give people a chance to kind of get wise and get with the system. No one listening today should take that as a get out of jail free card, right? Because there's no guarantee that will be in fact the case. But B, are you also expecting a similar sort of honeymoon period, or an easing in here where they won't drop the hammer immediately?
Yeah, I think, I see two sides to that. One, I see for most companies, for the average company that's out there that has customers in the EU, there will be somewhat of a grace period where you can come up to speed on, being compliant with GDPR. However, if there is a breach of any significance, I can guarantee you that the EU, who is enforcing this, will come after that company in a very big way, because they're going to look for some company to make an example of. The bigger the company, the better. The more well-known the brand, the better. They're going to go after some company to let everybody know that they're serious about compliance. I can almost guarantee you, as I sit here, that there will be a breach of some sort. It will be in the EU around GDPR, and the EU will pounce on that and make hay with that particular company in terms of enforcement of GDPR.
Agreed. So Jeff, we're about 45 minutes in here. I think we've covered our agenda. I don't see any other live questions right now. So I maybe we'll call it a break. This is the second one in this series that we've done on GDPR. I hope we've shed some light to help people. As we said, we're 30 days out and counting. We're in that final countdown. It's going to be interesting.
It definitely is. We're in the final days of it. It's interesting, like you said earlier on the call, companies haven't really paid too much attention to GDPR. We've had, at CA, we've had even a website, ca.com/GDPR, set up for, I think, I'm pretty sure about 2 years now. Mm-hmm. And we've had information on there. We now have an extreme amount of interest in going to that page simply because we've gotten so close to the deadline. But 2 years ago, nobody gave it scarcely a second look.
I got to tell you, we actually prepared, and so in our case, I'm a big believer of, if you don't have the scale, outsource it, right? So we outsource a lot of our data, PII storage and stuff to third party. But we've had to prepare our own, blurb, whatever, one pager that we're giving to customers and sponsors and visitors about, what we're doing to protect, sort of demonstrating accountability, as they say. Anyway, Jeff Hughes, as usual, what a great job, great discussion. We could sit and chat about this all day. Thank you. Hope to have you back soon on another DevOps.com webinar chat. But for now, I think we're going to call it a day on this one, guys. So for Alan Schimmel and Jeff Hughes, many thanks to CA Technologies for the sponsorship. We'll see you soon, everyone, on another DevOps.com webinar. Have a great day. Bye-bye, Jeff.
Goodbye.